If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment for more videos like this. What is the freakiest, most bone-chilling paranormal encounter you've ever had that no one would ever believe is true? In 2013, my wife and I divorced, and we both moved into separate homes. The divorce went well, and we are still good friends to this day, partly because we have a daughter together. We agreed to split custody over our daughter, and I rented an old house in a historic district in the city where we live. It was a very pretty home, built in 1935, but kept up very well. I would have my daughter for 2 weeks at a time, and she had a bedroom in the back of the house. She was 3 years old at the time, and I kept noticing her talking to her friend. One day I found her in a little closet talking to someone, and I remember her saying she was talking to another little girl named Betty. I have no idea where she heard the name Betty, as she was only 3 years old, but I just chalked it all up to a child's vivid imagination. Keep in mind that I am a single dad to a little girl. I really have no idea what I'm doing when it comes to dressing, hair, or just little girl stuff in general. Her mother is good at that stuff, but not me. I put my daughter to bed one night after her bath. I remember brushing her hair that night, but that was all I did. The very next morning, her mom came to pick her up from my house, and my daughter was just waking up. Her mom went back to her bedroom to find my daughter's hair fixed in 2 perfect French braids. Her mom was really proud of me at first that I had done her hair so cute, but I told her I didn't and couldn't do that. I can't even braid her hair, much less do perfect French braids. We asked our daughter how her hair got fixed, and she told us that Betty had done it during the night. I broke the contract on the rental agreement and moved out within the next month. In junior high, my friend Karen invited myself and 3 other female friends to a sleepover at her dad's house. There were 5 of us, and one was a very close friend of mine. We are still friends. We were in Karen's room, downstairs. Karen had a Ouija board and had used it in the past. The rest of us had never seen one. Karen was happy to play and told us it was no big deal. The rumors of Ouija boards being dangerous were not true. She assured us nothing bad had ever happened to her from playing with it. We began the game, and at probably 30 to 40 minutes in, the board rose a few inches from the floor. We all kind of freaked out, laughed, and asked, "Who's holding the board?" At nearly the same time, we all looked beneath the board to see if one of us was holding it in the air, while none of us were. We were scared. Karen freaked out. We were yelling that we didn't want to play with it anymore and that this wasn't funny. She told us to calm down and be quiet. We still had our fingers on the board, and somehow it was lowered to the floor. Karen returned the board to the game closet in the hallway. I still don't know how the board rose or lowered. Never again. I was a 9.5-year-old boy. This happened a decade and a half ago. Don't believe me. What I'm saying is truthful, though. It was summer vacation, the time was noon, and I just took a shower. With a towel wrapped around my waist and dripping wet, I was feeling happy like a good, naive boy. I went into my bedroom, which I shared with my parents. I was picking out clothes, and no one was in the room with me. Almost as soon as I walked in, I could feel the ground vibrating. As I picked up clothes, I felt the vibration coming from behind me around my parents' bed. It went on and off like a cycle, but each time the vibration came back stronger. I wanted to ignore it and go about my happy day. Eventually, I couldn't ignore it anymore. I put on my shorts, and with my t-shirt at hand, I turned around to see what was going on. It was exactly as I imagined. My parents' bed was shaking for no discernible reason. And it seems to be coming from underneath. The shaking got so bad that other objects started to shake from the bed hitting the ground. Then it stopped again. But this time, right in front of me, I saw this weird creature crawling out from underneath the bed, about 1 meter or 2 away. It was the blackest thing I ever saw in my life. It was hard to discern features on this thing. It looked like a goofy 2D object, but it had 2 legs, a torso, 2 arms, and a head. It didn't know I was there in the room staring at it. It was about my size, and I looked around for a second. I interpreted that as it brushing its shoulders off after crawling. Then it suddenly stopped, its eyes turned to me, and I could see fear. It was scared of me more than I was scared of it. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity but was probably more like fractions of a second. Then, without moving one bit or making any noise, it disappeared from my existence. My theory is that if it were real, it was an extra-dimensional creature I saw that day. Yes, my day was ruined. I saw a skinwalker once. I was 15 and on a camping trip in the mountains. At about 1 in the morning, I woke up to pee. There was a spot I had used earlier that day, but it was a couple hundred yards away. Being young and confident, I chose to walk all the way there. After leaving a note on my whereabouts with the time labeled on it, I left. Trust me, that bit's important. About halfway to the spot, I started whistling. If you're from the Southwest, you know why that's a bad thing. As I walked, an uncomfortable feeling washed over me. When I stopped walking, I could swear that just for a moment, the sound of walking continued. Slowly, I scanned my surroundings, doubting myself yet unable to stop myself. After a minute of searching, I continued my walk, now more quietly and attentively. When I got to the spot, I quickly did my business and turned back to camp, now convinced I was being watched. I looked at my watch and read 1:21 a.m. It seemed about right at the time. On my journey back, I heard something that made me freeze. Someone was whistling exactly where I had peed. I spun around to see the tree, with only damp pine needles next to it. However, that didn't console me. Memories of local stories and advice were flooding my head. I walked quickly, watching my surroundings as closely as I could. At many points, I heard branches breaking, steps, and scraping. After trudging through a fairly thick bunch of trees, now closing on my campsite, I entered a small clearing and stopped in my tracks. Standing in front of me was a deer. And I mean standing. On its hind legs. It was facing away from me, but I knew it could see me. It jerked its head back, one glowing eye looking right at me. Then I heard it, the thing's mouth didn't move, yet clearly and loudly, it spoke in my own voice. "You're not who I thought you were. Go home." It's impossible to portray just how scared I was in this moment. I couldn't move. I stuttered to respond, trying to sift through my fear. Hastily, I rubbed my eyes to calm myself. When I opened them, the deer was gone. I quickly looked around but saw nothing. I was just filled with the urge to run. So I ran back to my tent. When I got back, everyone was still asleep. I managed to not wake anyone, as all I wanted to do was get in my tent. Before I tried to go back to sleep, I checked my phone. The time read 3:12. Somehow I lost track of 2 hours during my walk back. I don't know where I walked to take that much time, and I don't know how I didn't notice. I was pretty familiar with the area and could still see faint light from the town. A couple years later, I told my coworker about it. He happens to be a Native American. Navajo, to be specific. He told me it was a Skinwalker and that I shouldn't break it up again. Something really creepy just happened to me. As I was driving home, a little girl ran out in front of the car in front of me, and we both slammed on our brakes. I thought she hit her, so I got out to check, as did the other lady. Guys, we couldn't find her. She wasn't under the car, she wasn't on the ground or on the side of the road. We both saw her. But I swear, she just vanished. I'm super freaked out. I got my phone out to call the ambulance and everything. The road is called Old 22 in Pennsylvania, near the Kutztown area. There's no local legend or anything that talks about a ghost girl on the road, and as far as I'm aware, there haven't been any accidents or deaths at that spot in at least 30 years, so if something did happen, it definitely is not recent. There are 2 large open fields on either side of the road, so we would have seen her if she ran away. We both saw her, so it wasn't just our imagination. She was young, maybe 5 or 6. She had light blonde hair and wore a blue dress. I never saw her face, it happened too fast, and I was kind of panicking. We searched the whole area for over 5 minutes looking for her, but there was no sign of her anywhere. We were both freaked out, so she said, "I think it's time to go." I said, "Good idea," and we left. I've lived in this area my entire life, and I drive by this spot almost every day, but I have never seen anything like that. I bought my first house in 2003 and was over the moon. Shortly after moving in, 2 of my neighbors began joking with me about the ghost in my house. Well, I thought they were joking, so I just played along, pretending I had seen one and it was no big deal. Well, as time went on that summer, I met more and more of my neighbors, and they all brought up the same topic. Finally, an elderly woman on the block who was quite kind and friendly told me a story after I'd asked her. I knew she wasn't going to screw with my head, which is why I asked in the first place. It turned out the previous owner purchased the home and never lived there because she said it was haunted. Sounds in the night of footsteps and sobbing, and glimpses of a man sitting in the kitchen covered in blood. One of my neighbors helped with the renovations of the house and said that he was putting up a dry wall when he felt something lift up his dreadlocks. Though I've had paranormal experiences before, it had been years, and by then I just chalked it up to night terrors. One day, I went to a small neighborhood video store to rent a movie. I had to fill out a form with my demographic data and then my credit card information. The owner of the store looked at the form and said, "Oh my God, you live in that house." I asked her what she meant, and she explained that her former employee had committed suicide in my house. She came to the house as soon as she'd heard, but the house had been taped off by the police as a potential crime scene. She told me that he had just moved into the house with his partner and called his mom because he wanted to invite her over to meet his partner and come out to her. This was in the early 1990s, when being gay was a big deal. His mother already knew he was gay because he bought a house with a man and disowned him right over the phone. That same week, he received a letter from an HIV testing center stating he had tested positive for HIV. This is when HIV was a death sentence. He then sat at the kitchen table, ate a bowl of cereal, and shot himself in the head with a revolver. Since then, she has had multiple paranormal experiences in the store, with videos flying off shelves and even levitating off shelves. The most I have experienced are sounds at night, sounds of Cheerios being poured into a bowl, I don't eat cereal, and sounds of sobbing in the kitchen. I often awaken to both. I remember my grandmother saying, "When the dead come to you, they want something. Perform an act of charity in their name and pray for them." So I did. I sat down at the kitchen table one night, lit a candle, and told him that each night I would recite a novena prayer for him before a lit candle. On the 9th night of the first novena to Saint Anthony, the patron saint of lost souls, I heard uncontrollable sobbing, felt a strong presence of grief and despair, and heard the sound of hyperventilating breathing, as though someone could not catch their breath. I sat in the presence of this, knowing it was not malignant but rather a connection of intimacy and compassion of which he was in need. For 45 days, I said a novena prayer before a lit candle for his soul and had a mass said in his name. A few times I had awakened to feel his presence standing over my bed, but I knew it was not a malignant presence. This still happens from time to time, but less and less frequently. This just happened, maybe 10 minutes ago. I'm home with my almost 1-year-old child and my dog. My 2 older kids have been at my folks' place for a few nights and have been gone since yesterday. They typically like to stay at Grammy's about once a month or so, it's a common occurrence. So I got the baby up, the dog is lying in the entryway to the hall where the bedrooms are. The baby was focused on something and being quiet. My dog looked toward the hall and kind of whined. Then I heard something that sounded like my daughter's. It wasn't a whole lot of noise, but definitely a giggle and sounds like toys moving from her room. It lasted a second or two, but my dog growled at this point while staring down the hall at the girl's room. I do need to add that my dog is weary of strangers, so he will typically growl at someone he doesn't know, so I don't think whatever this was is bad. It just startled me. I've never had this happen before while she was gone. Now my dog just keeps laying in the same spot, keeping watch. Normally, something like this wouldn't freak me out as much, but this is the first mimic I've dealt with in a long time. When I was a child growing up in the Missouri backwoods, probably around the age of 6 or 7, me and my older sister shared a room. One night, I heard something at the window. I got out of my bunk, which was at the bottom, and checked on my sister. She was still asleep. I decided to look out the window to see if I could tell who was out there. I opened the curtains, and there was a huge black bear with glowing red eyes clawing at my window. We lived in a trailer, but the window was at least 15 feet off the ground, if not higher. The bear was looking directly at me. I was frozen in fear watching this bear scratch at the window. Eventually, it stopped scratching and started punching the window. When the bear realized punching wasn't working, it bent down and came back with a huge rock that sat outside our window. It took the rock back like it was about to throw the rock, and I jumped into my bed and hid under the covers. It just disappeared. Throughout my whole life, 21, my dad has told me a story about his scariest paranormal experience. He swears to this day that the story is 100% true and never changes any of the details. Back in the 1990s, some parts of my country were occupied by the US government. Only Americans, and a couple of local people who were hired, were allowed to enter these territories. My dad was at least 21 at the time and was looking for some easy money, so he got a job as a night shift security guard for an American-owned business. The place was located on a country road, and in order to arrive, you had to drive for around 45 minutes through the complete darkness of the woods. He clocked in at 9 p.m. and clocked out at 4 a.m. He says that the job was extremely boring, so he just wandered around the building and wasted time. Once it was time to go home, another security guard would take over for him. He'd get in his car and drive through the lonely roads in complete isolation and darkness. One night, as usual, the security guard from the next shift came and took over for him. He got in his car and started driving back home. Somewhere in the ride, he noticed that there was a light far in the distance. It seemed to be static and in the middle of the road. My dad is a very superstitious man, so the first thing that came to mind was the stories of night riders claiming they saw La Llorona and how she would get into your car if you'd look back through the rearview mirror. He was sweating cold. He knew this must be the same entity he's heard of in the stories. He was getting closer and closer to the light, and the light beam was becoming more intense. The light was still in the middle of the street, static. He knew passing by was inevitable, and it was just a matter of seconds until they'd be right next to each other. He started praying, and right when he was about to cross the light, he closed his eyes. After a couple of seconds, he opened them back again and never saw back for the rest of the ride. A couple of nights later, he's hanging out in an American bar that was near the road he had to take to get to work. He was outside drinking a beer with this biker he had just met. Some drinks later, the biker tells my dad that something weird happened to him that night. He said that he was biking through the woods and stopped to drink some coffee. As he was serving himself, he heard a weird noise, and some light beams came out from behind a bush. He decided to go check it out. As he moved through the bushes, he encountered the source of the light directly and looked straight into it. He said he saw a standing woman with rotten flesh coming out of her skull. He bolted out of there, got on his bike, and went straight to the bar. My dad was shocked with fear. He knew that this was the same light source he had seen days before because it happened around the same area. He didn't let the biker know he had seen the same entity because he didn't know how to react. To this day, he recounts the story on occasion and swears by it, even getting goosebumps when telling it. I've always been skeptical about the story, though, because it could have just been a light source and just that. But I have no reason to distrust my dad either. I was 17 when this happened. I'm 28 now. I'm from England, so me and my friends were still too young to go to the pub, so one evening we decided to meet in the school field to have some drinks. From memory, there were around 8 of us just sitting in a circle in the bottom left corner of the field. For context to the story, I'll explain the layout. Running along the bottom edge of the field, there's a main road, which is behind a huge chain link fence and thick bushes. Along the left, joining the road, is a footpath that leads up to a bridge in the top left corner. This is all separated by more fencing and bushes. Along the top, behind a chest-high picket fence, is a small woodland area and a small river that runs under the aforementioned bridge. And to the right are houses. The only access to the field is a gate in the bottom right corner of the field, which is accessible by road, and in the top left corner is a small step-over fence, which you see on a lot of public footpaths in the UK. So we're just chilling out, having a few drinks, and listening to some music. I'd say no one is even half drunk. We're waiting on a couple more people to join us, who we know will be coming from the fence in the top left corner of the field by the footbridge. I was sitting facing the corner, and I noticed a figure kneeling down around 100 feet away. It was already dark by this time, so I couldn't make out who it was, but I could just tell they were male. I smiled to myself, thinking it was one of our friends we were waiting for trying to sneak up on us. Only the longer I watched them, the more I grew suspicious that it wasn't one of our friends. 5 or so minutes must have passed before someone else noticed the figure. We all discussed who we thought it was. I think we even shouted a few names of friends too, but the figure remained motionless. 3 or 4 of the guys, including me, finally got up to confront whoever it was. We walked towards them fairly briskly. We were probably only 30 or 40 feet away when the figure rose up into a standing position. I don't mean they stood up, they rose up. The black figure started to run backwards in a bizarre, almost mechanical fashion, and we gave chase. We gained ground fairly quickly as they ran towards the left-hand side of the field. One of my friends reached out to grab the person, and all of a sudden, the figure just vanished. We all just stopped in our tracks and looked at each other, not saying a word. And then we ran back to the group of girls we'd left behind, who saw the whole thing. We packed up our stuff and ran to the gate on the opposite side of the field. Some of the girls were even crying in fear of what had just happened. None of us could quite comprehend it. Even now, the only reason I know it actually happened is the fact that there were 7 or so other witnesses. A week or so later, me and one of the other guys that saw the ghost were back at the field gate, crashing another party. We were in the bottom right corner of the field, and guess what we saw across the field? A black figure stood by the fence at the back of the field, about halfway down. Don't ask how, but we could tell it was watching us. We stood in silence and just watched it for a minute before it drifted through the fence and towards the river, out of sight. We ran the short distance to the gate, clearly in a state of panic. People asked us what had happened, and we explained, but understandably, they all looked skeptical. I did a little research after this and found that a guy had been stabbed to death in the alleyway to the left of the field, and another guy had hung himself under the bridge it leads to. For anyone who wants to look it up, the place is called Ulster. I haven't been back to that field in over 10 years now, but a part of me wants to. I wonder if the ghost is still there. Just a little before I was born, I'm 22 currently, my parents used to live in a different house, and they always said the place was haunted. Lots of creepy things happen there, like things going missing, shadows under the door walking through the hallway, energy being too heavy, and them always fighting about the smallest things. My mom even says dogs would often sit outside looking out the master bedroom's window and start to howl. Really weird, huh? Things continued to happen even after they moved out. One night, they were coming home from a party, and they were fighting as usual. They got home, and when they opened the door, they saw a strange 6-foot-tall male figure with a fedora/black hat and a black trench coat standing at the top of the stairs, looking down at them. They both screamed at the same time and asked each other if they'd seen the same thing. The figure then proceeded to enter my parents' bedroom. My dad quickly grabbed a knife, thinking it was a thief or something, and got upstairs, but when he got to the bedroom, there was no one there. There were no signs of robbery whatsoever. They packed their bags and got the hell out of there. They quickly managed to get a new place, but they rented the old house to one of my uncles, who had just had his first daughter. My uncle said things continued to happen there. He said pans and casseroles continuously fell from the stove every time he cooked. When he was boiling water to warm up my cousin's milk, the baby bottles would often fly across the room, etc. The last time he recalled seeing something, he was warming up some formula for my cousin when he saw a pair of red eyes staring at him from the backyard through a window in the kitchen. The eyes continued to look at him, but they started to move as if the owner were walking through the yard and onto the street until they disappeared. After that, nothing else ever happened. We like to think about whatever was left. I've experienced a handful of paranormal experiences, but only this one sticks out as truly chilling and one that I still have no explanation for other than my belief that it was something demonic or an evil spirit at the very least. It was at a friend of my brother's house where my brother had left some of his things and asked if I could pick them up for him since he was currently out of state. Being the loyal brother, I went to get them, but decided to bring a few of my friends with me since I had already made plans with them and figured this would only take a second. While we were there, Roy, my brother's friend, kept telling us that there were demons in his house, and I chalked it up to him just being a little nuts in combination with him trying to scare us, but the first strange occurrence happened when I picked up my brother's things. Among my brother's things was his old Bible. Curious as to what notes he may have written in it, I opened it up but quickly discovered that every other page in the 1,000-page Bible was stuck together with what looked like pieces of double-sided tape. Although it startled me, I still did not believe it was something supernatural and rationalized that Roy went to this extreme measure to convince us of his story, but what happened next confirmed it. One of my friends, Mike, had to take a call from his then fiancée, now wife. During this time, I saw him come back inside, walk across the room, and enter the hall without looking at us. Since this was a house he was not familiar with, I thought it extremely odd that he didn't say anything or ask where the bathroom was, for example, so I called out to him. No response. I walked out into the hall where he went, and it was just darkness. I called out to him again. No response. At this point, it felt like the temperature in my blood dropped 10 degrees, and I could have sworn the classic cliché of the door closing behind you was starting to happen. I propped the door with my hand before it closed and promptly went outside to find Mike still on the phone. I asked him if he had just come inside to use the bathroom or something, and he said, "No, dude, I've been talking on the phone. I don't even know where the bathroom is." As he saw the look on my face, he asked, "What's up?" And I simply told him that we needed to leave. I later explained everything to him in the car, at which point he clearly denied that he ever did such a thing and felt very uncomfortable knowing the story. We both agreed to never visit that house again. So I was only about 6 or 7 years old at the time, living with my grandmother and my twin sister. As a kid, I've always been a big believer in paranormal spirits, but I've never experienced anything like this before. Every day, my sister and I would go play around in our pasture because we did live in the country after all. My grandma would always say that this tree in our pasture was our mom's tree. I didn't know what that meant, so I decided to just let it go. But one day, while playing in the pasture, my sister and I almost felt drawn to this tree. We didn't have a bad feeling about it at the time, but I am 13 now, and the more I think about it, the more chills I get. We walked over to this tree and just started digging. I don't quite remember why we were digging, but it was not so deep under the dirt that we found a golden butterfly. We tried to see if there were any more golden butterflies, but there weren't. We took it inside and cleaned it off, then lit it in a drawer in the kitchen. The next day, the same hole where we had just dug was perfectly fine. There was no sign of digging at all. Not to mention, we left the hole as is. We were curious as to why this was, so we dug once again. We found another butterfly and did the exact same thing. I cleaned it and put it in the drawer. My sister was happy that we had found 2 butterflies already, and I was as well. Over the next 5 days, we kept finding butterflies. Golden butterflies every time. Every time we came back to the tree, there was no sign of anyone digging. The ground was flat and fine, like no one had even touched it. One day, The butterflies stopped appearing, and this is what creeped me out. Now we had collected at least 7 golden butterflies and left them in a drawer, but the next day all of them were gone. We asked our grandma if she had seen them, but she said she had no idea. My sister insisted that we had better go check under the tree, but none were there either. It makes me wonder, where did these butterflies go? Why did we keep finding them? I don't know the answers, but it's definitely a pretty freaky story to this day. If you ever find a golden metal butterfly, maybe it's a sign, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's a good thing, or maybe it's something that spies on your life. I live in a small town in Scotland called Greenock, and about a decade ago, me and my mother had just moved into a new home right next to my grandmother and sister. The houses were attached, so it was handy if we ever needed anything. About maybe a year into living there on yet another cold wet night, which is what every day and night are like in Scotland, my mom had to sleep in my bed because I was recently diagnosed with epilepsy at that time, and she had to keep an eye on me while sleeping because that was the only time I took seizures. Anyway, on this night, we were just relaxing like any other night and had been laying in bed watching Blue Bloods on my Xbox when, out of nowhere, we started to hear the unholy screams of what sounded like a lady. It sounded like she was about to be murdered, so I jolted forward to go and help, thinking I could have it in my naive young mind when my mother threw her hand in front of me and said, "Lie down, son, that's nothing of this world." I asked her what that was, and she replied, "I'll tell you in the morning." With that, my mom's mobile began to ring, and when she answered, it was my sister, who stayed right next door. She was crying and sniffing down the phone, asking my mom if she could hear it, if she could hear the screams. I can't remember what my sister said after that. We began to hear what sounded like very loud stomping. I looked at my mom and asked what on earth that was, and she just said, "She's looking for something, she's climbing the house." With what sounded like stomping coming up the side of the house, just as it reached my window, it fell silent. My mom asked if my sister was still there, but the connection had dropped for whatever reason. After that, we both just lay in silence. I didn't understand it, so it didn't really bother me too much, but now that I'm older, my mom told me about 2 years ago exactly what that was, and she told me it was a banshee. At that point in my life, I was already very new to the paranormal and was blown away to find that out because it had completely left my mind by that point. It still terrifies my sister when we discuss it. Out of all 3 of us, I'd say she was the most freaked out by far. I've had several terrifying experiences, but the one that really sticks out is when something followed me home from the location I was shooting at. Let me preface this by saying that I'm a photographer who documents abandoned buildings. I try to capture the beauty in what has been left behind, and it's something I'm very passionate about. I had been to said location about 4 to 5 times at the time of this experience. Everything was going perfectly fine while I was there, nothing was worrying me, and I was going about my business and taking my pictures. That all changed when I got home later in the day. I was super excited to upload my photos to my computer and start combing through them. As soon as I saw the first photo, I immediately shut down my laptop and had this absolutely dreadful feeling. I physically could not look at the photos I had taken. A few hours after that, it was time for me to get some sleep. I crawled into bed, still shaken by the feeling I had earlier, but I figured it was just my usual habit of overthinking. Around 2 to 3 a.m., I am jolted awake, but I don't sit up. I'm too scared to sit up because I can feel something in the corner of my room watching me. My entire body felt like a jolt of electricity had shot through it. I keep pulling the covers over my face, hoping it'll go away eventually. I never got the courage to look in the corner, but I could feel that it was a dark mass, possibly childlike. Although I was absolutely terrified, I didn't feel threatened at all. It eventually subsided, and I have never experienced a feeling like this since then. It's hard to explain, but this place just had a strange hold on me. It's like something wanted my help to get out. I stopped going after my 7th visit. I still want to go back, but I promised myself I wouldn't go back for a few years, which is easier now that I don't live in that part of the country anymore. I will never forget my experiences here, and the history of the location will stick with me forever. I work mainly the closing shift at the local Walgreens, which is 2 p.m. to 10 p.m., and being in Minnesota, it gets pretty dark pretty early this time of the year. The work day itself went pretty quickly, nothing out of the ordinary or anything that would give me a sign that I was about to have an encounter with something that was definitely not human. The thing is, I live with my aunt, and I do not own a car or even have my driver's license, so I have to bike to and from work. The route I take to and from work is fine during the day, but at night, it takes on a different presence. For a little bit of the way, there are street lights and busy roads, but not for very long. The way home is covered in pitch black darkness. I normally just counteract it by taking out my phone and turning on the flashlight, but this night I wasn't as prepared with my phone as I normally was. Once the clock ticked to 10:30 and I clocked out of work, I stood outside in the chilled night air and slipped my arms out of my sweater sleeves and turned it around so that the hood of the sweater was in front of me. I always call my girlfriend once I get out of work just because the way home uneases me somewhat, so it just feels good to have her voice filling me with comfort as I bike home in the darkness. I dropped my phone into the hood, called up my girlfriend, and began to unlock my bike while she told me all about her day. As I set out towards home, I became distracted by just listening to her talk about something she did at school, so when I got to the point of the route home where the street lights end and the darkness begins, I started to slow my biking pace down, looked down at my hood, and began to grab my phone out of it. When the hair on the back of my neck stood on end, I felt my body go into alert mode, my heart beat faster, and I felt a chill go through me. That's when I tapped on my flashlight app on my phone and raised the light so I could illuminate it in front of me. It was when the light illuminated a sickly pale, inhumanely skinny figure. I froze in fear as I watched this creature glance back at me slightly and let out a low, guttural growl, and within a blink of an eye, it leapt from the path and into the heavily overgrown woods. This sent my body into fight or flight mode, to which I chose to flee. There was no way I was going to stick around and see what this creature was or planned to do with me. I dropped my phone back into my sweater hood, kicked off the path, and stood up as I biked, pedaling as fast as I could, though it was futile as I heard the creature let out a high-pitched screech and keep pace with me, its limbs thudding to the ground with ease as if the trees and bushes and just nature itself were merely an illusion, as it began to chase me as if it were on a hunt. I pedaled and pedaled faster and faster until I couldn't push the bike to go any harder. It took only a few minutes at my pace to clear the forested path, where I heard the creature's movement stop and the night grow silent again. After the encounter stopped, I heard my girlfriend's voice snapping me back to the world. Her voice sounded very panicked and worried. I told her about what had just happened, and she just sort of brushed it off, saying I was probably just tired and imagined it. I didn't feel like arguing with her about it. I know I didn't just imagine myself seeing a creature and then imagining its growls and screeches and it hunting me. There is just no way that vivid of an encounter could have just been my imagination. After a while of just talking about random things with my girlfriend, I managed to get calmed down. I was about halfway home at this point, which would convert to 15 minutes left of the route until I hit my aunt's house. At this point, the path just cuts through this hilly field. As I got closer and closer to that area, I noticed a rather odd scent that most definitely didn't belong there because there are no buildings, restaurants, etc. around that field. But anyway, the scent of very fresh blueberry pie or waffles, I don't really know how to describe the scent other than just a very fresh blueberry scent, filled my nose coming from the direction of a wood that was way on the other side of the field, which immediately snapped my mind back to the creature I had encountered. I felt my hands tighten against the handlebars, and I snapped away from the tantalizing scent and just biked away faster, pushing my body and my bike harder. I made it home faster than the 15 minutes it would have normally taken me. I put my bike in the garage and quickly walked upstairs into my bedroom, logged into my laptop, and began to search online for urban legends and paranormal stories about the area I live in, but nothing could describe the encounter I had. As the days passed from my encounter, I kind of just pushed it to the back of my mind until just yesterday, which was yes, Halloween, but it was 10:30 at night when I felt that same sense of fear. I felt the night of the encounter. I slid my laptop off my lap, stood up from my bed, and walked over to my bedroom window. As the blinds were open and the window was open as well, I shivered from the chilled night air and shut the window when I froze, because off in the distance, standing by a tree that was roughly 10 feet away from the house, in the backyard, was the sickly pale body of the creature staring up at me. I felt as if it were staring deep into me, sensing my fear. I quickly closed the blinds and locked the window, got back into bed, threw on some random videos, and played some games to distract my mind until I slipped off to bed. I sit here typing this story, hoping that last night was the last time I would ever see that creature. I started dating my wife at the end of August, 2007. My favorite holiday is Halloween, so I thought we should do something fun, like go to a party or go on a zombie walk, but she was scheduled to work until 10:30 at a coffee shop. I decided to hang out with some friends and look online for some legitimately haunted places in Phoenix. I found a few that sounded cool and then ran across one at Jefferson Park in Mesa. We had to check it out because I had gone to Jefferson Elementary as a kid. The school is located just a bit north of the park. The story of the haunting on the website told of a young girl who had been murdered at the south end of the park near Broadway Road in the early 90s. I sort of remember hearing about this when I was a kid, but my family lived on the other side of the freeway in a better neighborhood, so they weren't very concerned. My wife, a girlfriend at the time, and I got to the park around 11 p.m. and sat on the swings talking until around 1:30 a.m. I decided the story was total BS and told her we should go home. Right then, no shit, right then, we both saw a female walking along the southwestern edge of the park. There were no streetlights on that end of the park, so she was pretty shadowy. She was also walking ridiculously fast. It seemed sort of normal, but there was something odd about it. Finally, we realized that she had no gait. It was like she was sliding or floating very quickly along the sidewalk. Now it gets a little weirder. There are streetlights on the southeastern edge of the park, but when she got there, she was still shadowy. She turned north and walked up Jefferson Avenue, and we watched her until she was occluded by a building. We ran to the car to try to drive past whoever we saw to make sure it wasn't just a worker on her way home, but there was no one down Jefferson Avenue. We looked and then drove down each street, coming off Jefferson, and still saw no sign of any walker. It was weird. I grew up in a wooded area on a gravel road with houses pretty distant from each other. Now let me start by saying that my dad has told me pretty creepy stories about this road that he grew up on. My mom and dad split up, and I stayed with my mom and my stepdad on that road. We lived by a graveyard just right up the hill from us, about 40 yards. I was about 8 years old at this time. Here we are all sleeping on the living room floor, my mom, my 2 brothers, and me. My other brother was sleeping in his room, and my stepdad was sleeping in their room. Why me and the others were sleeping in the living room floor I am not sure. So, here it is, about 1 a.m. in the morning. I suddenly woke up, not by a noise, not by a person, just naturally. When I wake up, there are hundreds of ghosts hovering in the air, like they all had a picture frame they could make movement in. None of them were large, they were just all miniature-sized ghosts, probably about 1.5 feet tall, but in the air. I couldn't be afraid. I proceeded to just stare at them as they stayed for several minutes, but it felt like hours. I remember seeing a boat, a very large boat, that some ghosts were on. Why? I am not sure, but some of those graves are from the 1840s. Also, a very important part to add is where our trailer was. My great-grandpa said that people from the war were buried there and that African Americans were hung up on the hill by the graveyard that was fenced off between the graveyard and where they supposedly got hung. In our yard was where soldiers walked back in the Civil War, and Fort Benton is literally not even half a mile from my house. Now, back to it, I remember seeing this ship and quite a bit of people on it. I just stared and watched their every move, but I heard no sound. I then woke up my mom, and I must have woken her up quite loudly as my other brothers laying on the floor woke up as well. This is where it gets interesting. No one seemed scared, they were just all speechless. My mom didn't even wake up my stepdad, she just instantly picked up the phone. She called our closest neighbor, who was very religious, and asked her if she would come up. Why my mom chose her, I have no idea. Our neighbor came over, and it was the craziest thing, all the ghosts were still there, like nothing scared them away, which is rare in most ghost sightings. So, by this point, it had to be at least 30 minutes since these ghosts had been here. Our neighbor proceeds to open the Bible. We were all very religious families. As I sat and watched her, she began speaking in tongues out of this Bible. Eyes closed, one arm up, and speaking away. After about 5 minutes, they all disappeared at once, just poof gone. So I'm Irish. My whole life, I and my cousin have seen this woman beside the water. We nicknamed her the Water Witch, and our moms never took us seriously until one day we were all on holiday in a caravan park and we saw her washing clothes by the stream just behind the fence. My mom also said she saw her. Anyway, she's appeared on and off throughout our lives. We're now both in our 30s. I just recently discovered the Scottish version of a banshee. She washes her clothes in streams and always appears in the water. We aren't Scottish, though our great-great-grandfather always wore a long black cape. I hate thinking about it, to be honest. As I grew up and made peace with reality, it always wore a long black cape. I hate thinking about it, to be honest. As I grew up and made peace with reality, it was just childish imagination, and maybe my mom was just saying she saw her as a bit of a laugh, but then I read about the Scottish banshee, and it made me so uneasy. She's never said anything, we only saw her washing clothes once, others were beside water, sometimes it's been a fleeting glimpse and she's gone again, but we both have always seen her when she's there or we're there together. We saw her face once, and even though the Scottish banshee is supposed to be an old woman, she was a beautiful young woman with very pale skin and looked sad with jet black long straight hair. Kinda looked like Andrea Corr, making jokes to avoid the fact that this is actually bringing up some kind of trauma. We used to live in a house where the previous owner had unlived themselves, not in the house, but I believe this carried some dark energy around it. I remember my sister telling me this story when she had one of her friends over. So my sister was planning to take a shower, her room and bathroom were connected. Her friend told her she was going upstairs to grab something to eat. After my sister finished showering, she went into her room to see her friend weirdly sitting on the ground at the end of her bed. When she asked her what she was doing, she got no response. She asked again, but still nothing. So she told her she was going upstairs to eat, and when she went upstairs, she saw her friend. Confused, she asked her if she was just downstairs, and she said she had been up there the whole time. On another occasion of this happening, she woke up to this same strange girl sitting on her windowsill, thinking it was me. She asked me what I was doing and told me to go back to my room. All it said was, "Shh, go back to sleep." I also remember waking up in the middle of the night one time and seeing this girl sitting on my dresser and watching me. She had a strange energy around her. I could never tell if she meant negative intentions or was just observing. In 2017, 5 of my friends and I moved into our new house to find we weren't the only ones living there. We've been looking forward to moving in for almost a year. The second year meant no more cafeteria food, dons, or public bathrooms, only 6 friends living together. We quickly made the house our home, decorating the walls and hosting a few too many housewarming parties. We felt safe, happy, and comfortable in our new place. Shortly after settling in, my housemates and I heard inexplicable sounds throughout the house. We'd hear the shower sliding door move on its own, footsteps sound from upstairs, and the front door open and close. Shortly after settling in, my housemates and I heard inexplicable sounds throughout the house. We were suspicious of the sounds but quick to brush them off and continue with our lives. That was until the evening of October 25th. While all 6 of us were sitting around the dinner table, a pan on the stove began to rock back and forth on its own. We tried to play it off as normal, but nothing could explain the shaking. We decided we'd had enough. We had to get to the bottom of these strange occurrences. 10 minutes later, we'd lit candles and set up a homemade Ouija board in the middle of our table. To use a Ouija board, each player lightly places one finger on the planchette, a wooden triangle used for these ceremonies, and questions the room's spirits. If one is contacted successfully, the planchette moves itself around the board and spells out words or numbers to answer the questions. Is there anyone here? We asked the board. No response. We asked again and again, but there was still no response. After a couple more tries, the planchette dragged itself to the word yes written on a piece of paper. Once we were sure there was someone there, we continued to ask questions to find out who exactly we were talking to. What's your name? We asked. Slowly but surely, the planchette moved to the letters A, D, and Y, until it spelled out Adasat. My housemates and I continued to communicate with him for a few minutes, until we felt we were no longer speaking to Adasat. We asked if there was another presence with us, and it turns out there was. This time, the spirit's name was Pam, a 3-year-old good spirit, according to her. Realizing there was more than one spirit with us, we asked the board how many there were in our presence. The planchette slid to number 8. With news of our 8 additional roommates in mind, we decided that was enough for one night and stopped the game. After looking up the standard conditions for using Ouija boards, my housemates and I discovered we'd broken some of the rules on our first try. Ouija boards are supposed to open the connection to the spirit world, attracting and inviting spirits from all over. They shouldn't be played at home. If you play where you live and connect with a malevolent spirit, it can stay in your house. Spirits can't be trusted. A spirit can take possession of players and gain access to their minds. The next night, we decided to break out the Ouija board and play again. This time, when we asked how many spirits were with us, the answer was 27. After asking who was with us a few times, we compiled a list of names: Nudu, Veerd, Lukov, Matt, and Corey, to name a few. When asked whether or not they had good intentions, Nudu was one of the few that replied, no. I suggested asking Nudu if he'd taken possession of any of us. He answered no until it got to my housemate, Emily, and the planchette quickly swiveled over to yes. We put Nudu's answer to the test by asking personal questions about Emily that only she'd know. How many concussions has Emily had? I asked. The planchette made its way over to the number 4. We looked over at Emily, who had a look of horror on her face. Nudu was right. While Nudu answered the rest of our questions correctly, we couldn't rule out the fact that Emily's hand was on the planchette. Maybe she was purposely or subconsciously guiding it in a certain direction. We told Emily to take her hand off the board but stay where she was. Then we asked, what is Emily's brother's girlfriend's last name? None of us knew the answer. The board replied. We looked over at Emily, and she confirmed that it was the right name. We were all in disbelief. A few of my housemates decided they were done playing and lifted their fingers off the board. Without even asking a question, the planchette moved to the corner of the board. With only 3 remaining fingers on the edges of the shot glass planchette, we never could have made that happen on our own. Although that was the last time we ever played Ouija, the story doesn't end there. The following weeks were bad. My housemates and I were constantly uneasy in our home and got especially nervous at night. We all felt as though we were being watched, we saw dark shadows in the corners of our rooms and suffered from horrible nightmares. Emily would often wake up in the middle of the night screaming for help, convinced she saw a figure in front of her. One night, while I was lying in bed, I heard a noise coming from my window, like someone running nails up and down my wooden blinds. After too many sleepless nights, we decided to hire a medium. We showed the medium around our home and told her what happened. Although we didn't tell her where we felt the dark spirit, she was able to identify the exact spots where we felt their presence most. When the medium described the characteristics of the spirit she sensed, it was exactly the type of presence I'd felt. We all agreed that the spirit was an adult male in his late 20s or early 30s. He was a bit of a loner. Was this Adasat? She helped us remove the presence by lighting sage and encouraging him to go towards the light. We truly felt better afterwards. I no longer saw dark shadows in the corners of my room and stopped feeling like I was being watched at night. We thought this spirit listened to us, complied with the medium's instructions, and left. About a week later, when dropping off the payment for the sessions, the medium told us something that stays with me today. The spirit she'd helped us get rid of was now following her. Although this happened almost a year ago, there's still rarely a day that goes by where I don't think about these events in one way or another. This happened to me a few weeks ago during the day at the haunted road. This is about a scary encounter with what I believe to be a ghost. I decided to go during the day to gauge how active the road was. I was also alone at this time, thinking the road was safe. The first thing I noticed was that when I first stepped foot onto the road, it felt like I was walking into water. You know the feeling you get when you dive down into the water and feel a slight pushback? At the time, I thought nothing of it because I was so used to it at this point. My walk down was actually quite pleasant. I felt very calm down most of the road. When I got into the forested area of the road, though, I did get the feeling of being claustrophobic. When I got to the path to the tree named the Hanging Tree, things got a bit odd. I took a rest there because it was hot out and it was nice and shaded there. I decided that I'd take that time to ask some of the questions my friends were asking on Facebook. As I was doing this, I heard a loud thud in some bushes beside me, which made me jump and look down the path. The path I checked when I got there was empty, but now I had a human figure crouched at the side of the road, rocking back and forth gently. It looked like a young adult, wearing what looked like a dark t-shirt and dark denim pants, black shoulder-length hair, and darker skin. Concerned by this, I called out to it, "Hello?" It didn't have any reactions. So I called out to it again, "Hello?" Loud enough that it scared a bird out of the tree over top of whatever this was, but I still had no reaction. So I decided I was going to leave and not ask too many questions. After leaving, I felt watched till I got out of the wooded part of the road. Nearing the end of the road and walking fairly fast, I decided one last break before reaching the end would be fine. I can try and finish answering any questions and whatnot. So I started up again, but almost as soon as I started, I lost connection and the stream cut out. As I was trying to fix the stream, I sat down because the sun was now beating down on my full force. As I was fiddling with my phone to try and get it to work, I heard a loud thud from behind me, and some gravel hit my back. I looked back and saw a large rock only a foot away from me. It must have been thrown from the bushes that are there, and it just barely missed me. I started to panic at this point. If that had hit me, I would have been out for the count. I quickly got back up, and my stream started to work again. I said my goodbyes, made it to the end, and started to walk back. As I got back to the forested part of the area, it got worse. I started to notice on my right side that dark figures were darting through the trees, going the same way I was. They were tall, maybe 6 feet or 7 feet, wearing dark black robes. The weirdest and scariest part is that I could tell they had heads, but I couldn't see anything about them. I couldn't tell if they had features or not, it was almost a blur, but the rest of the figures were plain as day. So I started to run. Once I made it back to the pathway to the hanging tree, I was out of breath and had to sit. I noticed whatever was following me had stopped. Just to be careful, I kept a close eye on the forest. That's when I noticed the last thing. A bit into the forest, I noticed a large log lying down and noticed an object on it. At first, I was a bit blurry because I was exhausted, but as I continued to focus, I started to notice more, so I called out again, "Hello?" This time, I received a reply. The entities turned her head towards me. I could tell it was a little girl now, long dark brown hair wearing a brownish dress, The hair was all over the place, and she had pale skin but not ghost-like. In a soft and confused voice, she answered, "Hello?" Startled by this, I immediately jumped to my feet, and then I noticed something. She was looking my way, but for some reason she couldn't see me. She was looking around, trying to see who had called out to her, but she couldn't see anyone. She never got up from the log while doing this. So I called out to her again, "Hello? If you can see me, say something." Instead of answering or running away, like I believe a normal kid would at that point, she continued to sit there and just look for this mysterious person who she could hear but not see. Now I know that she could see me because it was a clearing between us for trees. There were no trees from me to her, there were trees on the left and right, but it almost seemed like where the tree had fallen, no tree would grow all the way to the road. I decided that I had had enough fun for that day and just quickly walked back to my car, got in, and left. Out of all my experiences on the road, that was the most eventful, and the best part was during the day. It proved to me that we weren't just freaking ourselves out at night, which I have constantly been told. It was a day, and I had full confidence that nothing was going to happen and that I was safe. The road proved me wrong once again. I have learned a few things on this road. No matter where you are on the road, who you are, or what time it is, you are not safe from its wrath. 2. If you show the road confidence, the road will tear it down and beat it out of you. 3rd, this road is haunted. When I was 14, me and my friend, let's call him Tom, stayed around our other friends, let's call him Josh, house. Josh had recently moved into this house, and there's already a few creepy notes around the house. It is in the middle of nowhere. There are 3 houses close to each other, then nothing but fields, forests, and farms for miles. The 3 houses are Josh's, a house that belongs to 2 white witches, and a bedsit where a man used to live. However, 3 years ago, he hung himself in the bedsit, and the police only found him when Josh's dog kept barking outside the bedsit and there was a weird smell coming from it. Every single person who lives in this house has had a paranormal experience of some kind. The house had an old cellar, which has 4 tunnels stretching off either side, and they can't find the plans for where these tunnels go. The cellar is always freezing cold to the point where you can see your breath, and whenever it gets opened, the dogs go crazy with barking. Me and Tom stayed over for the night, and both chose to stay in Josh's room as there was plenty of space. Everything was a normal night, a bit of gaming and late night chat about girls. Nothing out of the ordinary. We fell asleep fairly early, with Josh and Tom in a bunk bed, Tom on top of the bunk, and me on the floor. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps climbing the stairs. It unnerved me instantly because of the nature of the footsteps. They were very sharp and loud, and the steps would be climbed all the way to the top, and then it would start from the bottom again. In my head, I had visions of their cat climbing up the stairs, then sliding down the banister to the bottom and starting again. Their cat had a bed at the top of the stairs and always, without fail, slept in that bed. The family tried to make the cat stay with them, but he would always ask to leave and go to his bed. It also could not be the dogs, as they were not allowed upstairs and were normally on the opposite side of the house in their beds. So the cat was the only plausible answer for me. However, it was so loud that I did doubt myself a lot and was nervous. Could a cat really make that much noise? After about 10 minutes of the footsteps, I remember calling out quietly to Tom and Josh to see if I should go check on the cat, but neither replied to me. So I decided, duck it, let's check. I got up from the bed and walked to the bedroom door, and just before I put my hand on the doorknob, the room went ice cold. I had something, and I don't know what it is, but something stopped me from opening the door. Maybe a gut instinct? Maybe someone is telling me it was a bad idea. All I know is that I felt something I had never felt in my life before, something horrible. And with that, I realized something. The footsteps had stopped. I could visibly see my breath in front of me, and I was frozen in spot. I felt like something was behind the door, but I didn't know what. I couldn't turn on the light as it was by Tom on the other side of the room, and I was frozen, so I couldn't get there. I just waited. I will remember the feeling until the day I die. A feeling of dread. I slowly retreated back to my bed once I found my feet. I hid myself in my sleeping bag, keeping my eyes firmly on the door. The temperature of the room returned to normal, I was warm again, and most importantly, the footsteps continued again. I stared at the door all night. Eventually, I passed out. I woke up in the morning, and the door was open. I could smell bacon being cooked downstairs, and everything seemed normal. I eyed up the landing but realized there was no dread in me, nothing, everything was back to normal. I went downstairs and saw Tom sitting at the table and Josh making breakfast. "How did you sleep?" Josh asked. I decided to be brutally honest. Just in case it's happened before to Josh. I said, I heard footsteps all night. Loud. Did anyone else hear them? Josh looked slightly shocked and gestured over to Tom while mentioning that Tom had brought it up earlier this morning. I remember looking properly at Tom, who looked scared. He didn't answer, so I explained more. I did call out to you guys to ask, but no one answered, so I assumed only I heard it. I remember it as clear as anything, Tom, eyes fixed on the table, interrupting with, and you got up to check it. Yeah, I know. I explained I was going to, but everything felt horrible, didn't it? Cold. It was like someone had thrown ice-cold water over us. I thought you were going to open the door, but something inside me felt like if you did, something terrible was going to happen. I was shocked. He felt it too. It wasn't me being crazy. I asked him why he didn't say anything. He said he was frozen to the core. What he said next scared me the most. What would we have seen if you had opened that door? Sometimes your imagination can get the better of you there. Who knows what I would have seen? Maybe the cat heard me get up and come to check up on. Hi boys. Josh's mom had come in. Josh, you'll never believe what happened last night. We actually had Harry, their cat, come in to sleep with us. I felt sick. The cat wasn't in the bed for the first time since they lived there. So it wasn't the cat. It was definitely something else. What was climbing the stairs? Whoever it was, they heard me coming, and if I had opened the door, what would they have done to me? Who protected me? I will never know. Tom never stayed there again. It took me 6 years, but I stayed there when I was 20 for his 21st birthday party. Nothing unusual happened. The scariest thing I ever experienced was at my own, rented, home. In 2014, we moved into a rental built in 1923. We were there for about 6 months, and it was nice, but then things got weird. Mostly low-key stuff that was kind of funny sometimes. For example, my credit card went missing, and I assumed the wife had snagged it. Nope. I was approaching the land of pissed when she suggested I ask the ghosts where I was. To humor her, I did. 20 seconds later, the Blu-ray disc holder slid out, and on it was my credit card. The detached garage was the scary part. It was my workshop. In real life, I am an engineer. In my personal time, I am an amateur machinist. All my reference manuals were on a bookshelf with glass doors. The workshop often felt off. I was arranging my tools with my back to the bookcase, which weighed a couple 100 pounds with the books on it. I heard a strange sound, like something vibrating, and the bookshelf pushed itself off the wall, and my back went through the glass doors. Luckily, it did not cut me. I am a large and scary looking guy. After that, I spent very little time out there. We moved out in 2018 but are still in contact with our old neighbors. After we left, the house was empty, and the neighbor reported all the lights were going on and off, and she thought we were there and having trouble. I'm a 23-year-old boy whose family moved during the Yugoslavian War, 1999, from eastern Serbia to Switzerland. We used to live in a small village across the Danube at the Bulgarian and Romanian borders, a region that has a very colorful history. Many bloody historic events occurred on the soil where we lived. Roman emperors used to rule this area, as well as many historic figures such as Attila the Hun, Alexander the Great, or Lord Sepish, Vlad the Impaler, who all once resided here and fought battles. The region has been occupied many times, the longest was under the Ottomans. This occupation lasted for almost 3 centuries. After the Ottoman occupation, the country didn't have much time to recover, and the First and Second World Wars had already struck the country. Many people died during the First World War, 1/3 of the population. As a result, guerrilla groups, Chetniks, partisans, etc., were formed, killing even more people. In conclusion, many people were unjustly tortured and lost their lives, which is probably why there are many instances of the paranormal. Magic is very common here. The so-called Vlach magic or Vlaška magia in Valachian is said to be one of the strongest in the world, and many people tend to practice it and religiously believe in it. As a result, there are many stories about paranormal events. One of my favorites was a story my grandfather told me. He grew up in the forest in a small, old house, 300 years old. He was adopted by my grandfather, who used to be a leader in one of the upcoming resistance movements against the socialist regime after the Second World War. He fought in both world wars, and even with all this, he took great care of my grandfather and loved him as if he were his own child. 50 years passed since he left his home, and all of those people living here died, but my grandpa still visits this house and stays overnight here. This place creeps me out, even during the day. There's an aura to this place that just makes it uncomfortable to be here. I can't imagine staying here overnight. But he frequently does, and one day he told me a very weird story. While he stays there, he gets often visited. At first, I thought visits were like the ones you get from neighbors or something. But he told me that one night he woke up to a hand crawling his head. It was a huge white, pale man kneeling next to him and crawling his head, speaking with a calm voice in Blachki, the dying language that we use to speak here, a mix of Moldavian and Romanian. He told me that his skin was white and that it was glowing in the night. He didn't have any hair, and the hand felt very soft. My grandfather always respected the dead and was never really afraid. He told me he didn't really speak to him and just enjoyed his company, since he knew in some way that he wasn't evil. Another time, he told me that he used to fix small parts around this house. When it started to get dark, he slowly began getting ready to leave with his tractor because it takes like an hour to reach the next civilized place. While putting stuff back into the barn, he heard loud noises in the attic. It didn't bother him until even a plank was thrown down the stairs. He recalled one time they even threw a rock into the wheelbarrow that he was pushing into the barn. He told me he just turned around, locked the barn, and didn't even frown. They expect you to react, don't give them this pleasure, is what he told me while laughing. This makes them go crazy. Growing up, I heard a lot of these stories, and it really runs in our family, experiencing from time to time such encounters. The most scary thing that happened to me occurred during the summer of 2009. My grandfather told me during this summer break, as usual, stories from the past about how he used to walk these woods alone in the dark and what he experienced while doing so. And since I was in my teen years, I started to question the reliability of his stories. From time to time, I took out my old motorcycle and drove out into the forest. Driving around was the only time I could really think about stuff, and you know, in this type of state, you question everything and think about the world. So one day I took out my bike and decided to drive around. I still don't know why or how, but somehow I find myself driving to the old house he grew up in. I didn't really bother to question why my intention was to drive there, so I just kept going. I always believed that I was a kid, pure by heart, and no evil could do harm to me. While I was driving out, I thought about the probabilities of actually encountering a vampire. I live as mentioned in East Serbia, where vampires are widely believed. My grandpa always told me not to go out past dawn, but I didn't really care, so I still kept going. Remembering back, I thought that his intention was to keep me scared and not get lost in the woods, but being a teenager at the time, I thought I was invincible, and in fact, even if a vampire crossed my path, I would easily pass him with no harm. There aren't really streets there. It's just a dirt road between trees that leads to what seems like nothing. After an hour, even the dirt road started to vanish. While I was driving and thinking about how strong I am, I noticed that my hand felt very wet. I thought it was because I was sweating, since this region can get very hot. After taking a look at my hand, I saw that there was blood all over it. I thought it might be a bug that I had squished, but it was just too much blood, so I started to look for wounds, but my hand seemed perfectly fine. My heart slowly started racing, and I took a sharp turn and drew back home. I remember this as the moment I was the most scared in my life. I had the urge to look behind every second that I was driving through the forest. It seemed like someone was sitting behind me and just waiting for me to fall down. After arriving home and telling my grandpa, he just started laughing and told me not to question their abilities again. I have a ton of stories regarding these kinds of events. Also, we have a few witches in our family that used to practice black magic that was taught to them by their ancestors. I was a little over 2 years old and just starting to walk on my own when this event took place. My mom only told me this story around 3 years ago, when I was 32 and about to get married. My mother was raised in a very tiny fundamentalist Christian community and had no belief in the paranormal. She believed that our souls sleep until Judgment Day or something like this, ergo, there are no ghosts or spirits to haunt houses. Even over 30 years later, she still sounded terrified as she told me this. This woman, who always talks way too loudly, was literally whispering by the end of it, and she was white as a sheet. I believed her completely and still do. My mom never talks about stuff like this. I'm just glad I can't remember it too. In 1988, my parents had their second child. This was my brother, Victor, alias. We were very crowded in our rented flat with 2 babies. My parents decided to move to a rambling old 2-story farmhouse on a 7-acre plot in southern Ohio for more room for the family. It was way out in the sticks, and it took almost an hour to get to town from there. My mom said the first time I saw the house, I freaked out. I was crying and saying things like, "Don't like mean houses. Mean house, ugly house, don't like. Scary house, mama, don't like." My mom says this behavior was very out of character for me, but I stopped complaining about the house after a few weeks, so she chalked it up to the stress of the move. Now this house is ramshackled and in the middle of nowhere. The kitchen was to the far rear of the house and, until recently before we moved in, still had a working ancient wood-burning cooking stove against the back wall. This had caught the back wall on fire a couple of months before we moved in and caused a lot of damage. A lot of this damage wasn't fixed, so my young, broke parents got a very cheap rent agreement. Gotta love the 80s. On the second floor, directly above the kitchen, was a locked room. The landlord claimed it had heavy fire damage, but her son, who had done the repairs, claimed the only fire damage left was in the kitchen since it had been the worst and was beyond his skill level to fix. Either way, the landlord was adamant that the room was off limits, and my parents always respected that. I would have looked 100%. I know all this because I heard stories about the crappy farmhouse with the creepy door my whole life, and there were pictures of us in and around the farmhouse. The locked door was right next to the upstairs landing, so there was no avoiding it, and both my parents have told me it gave them the creeps. A few months after we moved in, my mother and I were in the yard with our pit/Doberman mix, Boss. She was hanging laundry, and I was rolling around with the dog. She said that just as she noticed that everything was way too silent, Boss started going ape SHT from surprisingly far away. About 500 yards from the house on the left, there was a small duck pond. Boss was in between the two, running towards my mom, then turning and running back towards the pond, barking frantically the whole time. My mom saw something thrashing around in the middle of the pond. She took off towards the water at full speed. Boss beat her there and dragged me out of the water himself. "Thank you, pupper, I love you." Although my mom was confused about how I got so far so fast and how I got into the center of the pond since it was over my head and I couldn't swim, she figured she underestimated me and brought in the baby gates and playpens. I was to be contained from now on. A few weeks later, she was cooking downstairs. Boss was outside, Victor was asleep in his crib, and I was in my playpen in my room upstairs. I also had a gate on my door and one at the top of the stairs. The stairs ran up from the side of the kitchen, so my mom said she could listen for us crying or fussing while cooking. My mom said that no longer than 15 minutes after the last time she looked in on us kids, Boss started going crazy again in the yard. She runs up to check on us. Victor's still sleeping, every baby gate is still shut and locked, but I am not in my room. A frenzied search reveals I'm not in the house at all. A sudden image of Boss saving me from drowning causes my mom to rush outside to see what he's trying to tell her this time. She said he was running circles in the yard, barking uncontrollably. When she got outside, he took off towards the right, away from the pond. He would run ahead, turn around, and bark at my mother, waiting for her to catch up a little before racing off again. He ended up leading her for almost a mile and a half out onto the dirt road that separated our property from our neighbors. He led her to a thick stand of trees on our neighbor's side of the rocky drive. She said what hit her first was the foul stench of advanced decay. She plowed into the trees with her heart in her throat and her stomach full of ice. She said she noticed many piles of corrugated tin, tarps, tires, and other debris. The miasma was emanating most strongly from these junkyard cairns. Peeking under a sheet of tin, she discovered the extremely decomposed corpse of a butchered cow. As she headed deeper into the thicket, where the tree cover was denser, she said less care was taken to cover the remains. Grisly pieces of bones and rotted chunks of bovine littered the area. Apparently our neighbor, in an effort to cheat his taxes, had been illegally slaughtering cattle and hiding the remains in, at least, one of the few thick stands of trees around. She found me in the dead center of this thicket, just standing there looking around like I was confused, surrounded by carnage. She said I didn't seem scared or anything, I was just standing. She rushed over to me and, after ascertaining that I wasn't injured, began questioning me on why I was here, how I got there, etc. Keep in mind that, although my mother said I started speaking very young, I still didn't have much of a vocabulary. She said I told her, with that serious look only small children can give, that the children brought me here. Shatting her pants at the thought that anyone, even children, could walk right past her through the kitchen, get me from upstairs, and walk right back past her on the way down the stairs and out with me, she demanded to know what children and where the hell they are now. I looked at her dead serious and told her the ones that live with us in the room at the top of the stairs and that I didn't see them anymore. After a moment of stunned silence, she started asking all kinds of questions about these children. However, she told me that I refused to say anything else. She said that as long as she questioned me about what happened, I would just stand there, staring at her with a serious expression and my mouth closed. She said this same pattern held true every other time she brought it up to me, so she was always left wondering and immediately began hounding my dad about moving closer to town. While the incident with me getting to the pond was highly unlikely, it was at least remotely possible. My mother is adamant that being in the hidden slaughter yard that day was simply impossible. She says there is no way I could have even known it was out there, much less have the ability to open and relock the baby gates, get downstairs, past her, and end up almost 2 miles down the road and in this place in under 15 minutes. I was only 2 and as slow and clumsy as most toddlers. As I said, she is still shaken by it after 30 years. Personally, I have no idea what happened that day. I've thought about hypnosis but haven't yet decided. I really want to remember. Maybe it's better to let it be a mystery, because whatever those things were, I really don't think they were children. In the early 80s, I lived in Okinawa, Japan. My dad thought that seeing the world would be an adventure that would help my brother and I become better men, and I have to say I think he was right. Being in the military showed me cultures that many would never get to experience, and I am thankful for every experience that life gave me. Even the scary ones. While we lived in Japan, my father wanted us to have a fully immersive experience, so he chose to move us into a small Japanese neighborhood off base. We lived in a little house at the top of an enormous hill in a cul-de-sac that overlooked, I kid you not, part of a huge zoo and, on one side, a fairly large cemetery. Our particular house was set far above the monkey habitats, about a mile downhill. Between us and those habitats was nothing but a thick Indiana Jones-style jungle. The neighborhood kids, and I would tromp through endlessly, ignoring the local warnings about poisonous snakes and ancient untripped mines from World War II. We were the only American family living in that cul-de-sac, completely surrounded by Japanese families, and it was amazing. The kids loved us, and although we couldn't communicate through language very well, we understood each other perfectly most of the time. Opposite us was an older couple with a lush garden surrounding their property. The older woman wanted us to call her Mama-san, and she had us help her garden whenever she could coax us over with green tea and chocolate/banana cookies. We loved her. She was so welcoming and generous. As was everyone else, actually. We lived in a wonderful neighborhood. The only drawback to Mama-san's home, however, was that she directly overlooked the cemetery. And that cemetery was unlike any cemetery I had ever seen before. Because Okinawa is an island, burials don't happen very often. Instead, above-ground crypts are built. Many of them were built into the sides of the hills that make up the island. The crypts are large, made of huge arcs of polished stone set over a large square of that stone, which has a square insert cut into the middle of it for the coffin to be placed inside. Once inside, the square is inset with another piece of polished stone just inside, leaving a kind of shelf on the outside so offerings could be made to lost loved ones. Yen, food, flowers, and incense are some of the offerings given. Below Mama-san's house was a valley that swooped back up into another hill opposite her home. That valley and both hills were covered with these crypts, and spider webbing up and down through the crypts were various stone step pathways that were old and badly maintained. It was quite a sight. One evening, Mama-san asked me to come visit her alone. She had something to show me, but it was only for me as the older brother. Intrigued and a bit proud, I agreed. She took me to the back of her garden and sat me on a thick wooden bench that was carved with scenes of fishermen and men with swords. She told me she had a story to tell. Mama-san then disappeared for a few minutes and soon returned with a tray that held hot green tea and sweet rice cakes. Sitting next to me, she smiled and commented on the colors of the evening sky as the sun began to lower. Mama-san said she had seen me, my brother, and some other kids daring each other to follow a stairway path down into the cemetery. You have to understand that the path from our little home area down to the cemetery consisted of hundreds of steps, many broken or cracking, in and out of bushes, and at a steep incline. It would be dangerous for anyone, but the real test was seeing how long we could take walking through the crypts at night. Mama-san wanted to explain why that was a bad idea. Many years ago, during the war, Americans were thought to be devils. Monsters that would murder innocent citizens for no reason other than to kill. That fear was the product of wartime propaganda used to encourage young men to serve in the military and farmers to fight along with them. But many didn't. Many ran. And with nowhere to go and nowhere to hide, hundreds of Japanese citizens hurled themselves off a cliffside rather than face torture at the hands of their perceived enemy. I was terrified at hearing this. I had no idea this had happened. I was mortified and hit with such sadness that I started to cry. The sun was setting, and the sky went from pink and blue to a deep orange and red. Mama-san reached out and held my hand, telling me not to worry. This was in the past, and the past is something we must always remember so we never go back. She went on with her story. One young woman had followed through with this sacrifice with her 2 children. But she survived the fall. She was in a coma for months. When she did regain consciousness, she was horrified to realize she was not with her children. They had been buried somewhere in the cemetery below. In an unmarked crypt that held many others. The woman would spend days and nights searching the cemetery, crying in pain. The torment of her loss was unbearable. Until the day she threw herself into the ocean to hopefully be reunited with her lost family. But they say she never found her children. Her act of suicide doomed her to purgatory. She would remain tortured for eternity. The sun had disappeared, the cemetery drowned in inky blackness, and the main path was dotted with dim, broken lights feebly illuminating small areas. Mama-san continued. She still wanders the cemetery, she said, looking for her kids. You can hear her crying. And then she pointed down. I didn't want to, but I did. I looked. In the back of the cemetery, in the darkness, there was a white figure. At first, it had a bright, white shimmer. Moving slowly, kind of shaking. It moved from side to side, like it was moving among the crypts, and you could actually hear the crying. Softly at first, but then low moans and whimpers of pain as it got closer. I was terrified. I wanted to run, but Mama-san held my hand and whispered that she wouldn't come up here. We were too far. But that is why we shouldn't go down there after dark. She said many don't know her story and call her the White Witch, which angers her. It's best to stay away. It's best to pray for her. Mama-san said she comes out to see her often, hoping one day she will find her salvation. Needless to say, I never went down to that cemetery. Not once. And I never sat back there with Mama-san again either. That was enough for me. I did, however, visit Suicide Hill. It's called Peace Prayer Park now out of respect. I cried the whole time we were there. I prayed for all the souls and for forgiveness. So many Japanese citizens spoke to us, welcoming us, telling us stories, and sharing with us. I didn't feel worthy, and my love for the country and its people was overwhelming. I'll never forget my time there. I'd like to go back. To see if she's still there. Wandering the graves, looking for her children.